Hola a todos y todas. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas al webinar Mística y Estética Teológica. Mi nombre es Rocío Cortés, soy académica de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile y seré la moderadora del webinar de hoy. Este webinar está organizado por la red Eclesia en América, una red que se ha soñado de teólogos y teólogas latinoamericanas y latinos, que quiere conectar y promover el diálogo entre la teología de toda América para construir una verdadera Eclesia en América. Durante el seminario habrá interpretación simultánea del inglés al español. Si lo necesita, si lo necesita y está ahora en YouTube, venga a la sala de Zoom, porque aquí puede entrar a través del globo terráqueo, en la parte inferior, a la traducción que vamos a tener desde el inglés y en español, porque en esta ocasión el webinario va a ser completamente en inglés, ¿sí? Y hasta ahí yo llego con mi español y ahora vamos a hablar en inglés. Recuerden que si necesitan o están por la sala de YouTube, es mejor que vengan al Zoom para así poder acceder a la interpretación al español que vamos a tener de esta interesante conversación. ¿Sí? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Mysticism and Theological Aesthetics. I'm Rocío Cortés from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and I will be the moderator for the webinar today. This webinar is organized by the Eclesia en América Network, a network of Latin American and Latino theologians that wants to connect and promote the dialogue among theologians across the Americas in order to build a true Ecclesia in America, Church in America. During the seminar, it will be available simultaneous interpretation from English into Spanish. If you need it, please feel free to enter the correct room pressing the globe that is at the bottom of the screen. We have an exciting agenda planned for you today. Today's webinar will be a dynamic conversation with our two expert speakers about the intersection of mysticism, women, and theological aesthetics. We are thrilled to have with us today the Professor Janet Martin Soskice, a professor of philosophical theology at Duke University. I will tell you more about her in a minute. And Professor María Clara Bingemer, a professor of systematic theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. They will be sharing their insights and perspectives on the role of mysticism in shaping women's experience of theological aesthetics and the ways in which these experiences inform our understanding of the divine. Their expertise in the field is truly exceptional, as you may know, so we are very honored to have them join us today for this conversation. During the webinar, our audience connected here, thank you for being with us today, will have the opportunity to engage with our guest speakers as well. You can send your questions through the chat function, and we will collect them and pass them to the speakers during the Q&A session. We encourage you, of course, to interact during the webinar, share your thoughts and ideas, and ask questions. You will enrich, of course, the conversation with your questions and comments. This is a great opportunity to engage with experts in this field and learn more from their insights and experiences. Let me introduce you in detail our speakers and start with the first question we have prepared for them. Janet Soskice is a professor emerita of philosophical theology at the University of Cambridge, and since July 2020, she is also a William K. Warren Distinguished Research Professor of Catholic Theology at Duke Divinity School. Following an early book on metaphor and religious language, her new book is Naming God, which follows the footsteps of Moses from the Burnage batch. Janet is a past president of both the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain and the Society for the Study of Theology, and a former McCarthy visiting professor at the Gregorian University. Presently, she is also a member of English and Welsh Anglican Roman Catholic Commission. Her present interests are in religious language, doctrine of creation, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim dialogue, women and religion, and theology and the arts. Along with other scholarly books, Janet is the author of Sister of Sinai, which was read as a book of the week on BBC Radio 4 and became a bestseller, the true story of Scottish twin sisters born in 1844, who discovered one of the most ancient manuscripts of the Bible. Thank you, Janet, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Maria Clara Bingemer holds a degree in social communication from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. She also has a master's degree in theology from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and a PhD in systematic theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University. She's currently a full professor in the Department of Theology at PUC-Rio. For 10 years, she ran the Loyola Faith and Culture Center at the same university. For 4 years, she was an evaluator of graduate programs at the Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel. For 6 years, she was also the Dean of the Center for Theology and Human Sciences at PUC-Rio. She has experience in the area of theology, with an emphasis on systematic theology, focusing mainly on the following themes: God, otherness, women, violence, and spirituality. In the last few years, she has been researching and publishing on the thought of the French philosopher Simone Weil. Nowadays, her studies and research are primarily directed towards the thinking and writing of contemporary mystics and the interface between theology and literature, something we are gonna start discussing and talking right now. So thank you, Maria Clara, also for joining us. Maria Clara is also one of the founders of the network Ecclesia in America. So it's even more important that we can have the opportunity, Maria Clara, to be with you. Thank you. I have a first question for both of you, for Janet and Maria Clara. And it says like that: should we speak of mysticism or of contemplative theology? What do you think? Mysticism or contemplative theology? Who would like to start with the answer? Maybe Janet?
Please. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
well?
Perfect.
Yes. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Rocío, and all of you. I want to thank Ecclesia in America for the honor of this. It's a great pleasure for me. One thing I don't think many, maybe even Peter Casarella, my Duke colleague, doesn't know, that initially I was going to do my studies in Brazil on Candomblé. Initially I spent a Salvador doing this, thinking I would be a cultural anthropologist, working on metaphor and religious language. And then I realized, no, I was really a philosopher working on religious language. But to bring me back to Brazil and your countries is such a great joy. So this question, it's a real one. In the English-speaking world, the term mysticism has gained a certain currency since the work of William James. And it's from a Catholic point of view, a rather misleading currency, because James regarded mysticism as something out of the blue, extraordinary, solitary, and so on. And it made mystics appear as extremely unusual people, mystical experience extremely odd. Now, none of the people we presently call mystics, and I mean people like Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich, Therese of Avila, would have recognized this description of themselves. And indeed, as scholars have indicated, in historical terms, mystical just referred to Christological, to the Eucharist. It didn't refer to some bizarre kind of experience like extraterrestrials. So within the English-speaking world, mysticism has become aligned with something very private, very individual, and very odd. And so for that reason, I am happy to use the term, because you can't just say, okay, I don't like that term, so, don't use it. People do use it, and they use it in good ways. But I think I would prefer, as a theologian, to speak of contemplative theology, because a lot of this theology, it is emerging not from idiosyncratic experience, it's emerging from deep immersion in liturgy, in community, in scripture. It's deeply grounded in scripture. It is, in that sense, a deeply corporate kind of thought. It's not bookish theology. It's not church theology in the sense that we have to have church theologians who are addressing heresies that rise up in the church. It's contemplation. It's about formation of the individual in Christian life. So I would prefer to speak of contemplative theology in a way that makes us understand that this is not something of which, for a privileged few who are elevated like St. Paul for a few seconds up into heaven, but this is something for all of us. So that would be my initial thought on that. Thank you.
Thank you, especially because you somehow bring the concept to our contemporary times. So thank you. Maria Clara, what do you think about that? Like, should we talk about mysticism or contemplative theology?
Can you hear me well?
Perfectly.
Good. No, it's fantastic, Janet's answer, because I see the difference between languages is a very important element there. Because in Latin language, we speak about Mística, Mystique, very naturally, and we understand what we mean. And it's not this sense that you signed there. And I would agree completely with you. Mystical experience is not a bizarre thing, extraordinary phenomena, and etc. They might be there, but it's not the main thing. Santa Teresa of Avila was very keen on that. She always said her extraordinary grace wasn't the most important. The most important was the experience of love and friendship with God, and the works that flourish from there, no? So, but in English, we don't have another word. I know, because I suffer a lot when I go to US universities and I make my researches in the libraries, and I want to find things on mystical experience, and I have to go on mysticism because this is the word. But I would agree with you that contemplative theology would give us a broader sense of what we mean. I like the word Mística and Mystique because it reminds of mystery. And I think the narratives and the experiences of those women you mentioned, of my women, my contemporary women, Simone Weil and Etty Hillesum and Dorothy Day, they have an experience of loving encounter and union with the mystery. But this brought them to an engagement in the public realm with justice and all the struggles I can imagine. So I think perhaps the theoretical, the theory that the thinker that put it most exactly was Karl Rahner. He said that the Christian of the future either would be a mystic or either wouldn't be Christian. And he affirms and he states that mystical experience must be in the everyday life, in lo quotidiano, like the Latin theologians say, the Latino theologians say. So I think the contemplative theology perhaps would be clear on that we want to say. Nevertheless, I would call your attention for a recent book. I had the honor to write the preface of a young theologian, Afro-descendant, Andrew Prevost, and the title is Mystical Theology. It's fantastic. He has chapters on feminism, on Black theology, all connected with the contemplative theology and the mystical experience. I think perhaps mystical experience would be better than mysticism if we want to go there.
Thank you. Your answer made me think also how contemplative life can also be open for all kind of people, not only the chosen ones or the special ones, but it's something like that we can. Exactly. So thank you. And continuing with our conversation, thinking about theology as faith-seeking understanding. What's theology for this day for you? Who would like to start? What's theology for? That's a question that covers different and can be answered from different angles. So how would you define, maybe if it can be defined, theology? Or the role of theologians?
Do you want me to begin again?
Yes.
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 Okay.
So Maria Clara can.
I'd be
but
happy.
next time
I'd
you
be
start,
happy.
Maria Clara. Okay.
Okay. Well, theology, as we all know, words about God. Aquinas would have thought Aristotle could do theology in that sense, and what Christians were doing was Sacra Doctrina. But theology today, in one sense, there's academic theology, and many of us work within an academy, and there are many things that are theology and are genuinely important. There's history, there's philology, there's manuscript work. All these things are part. Theology isn't done by one person and never was. It's the corporate life of the reflective community of some part of the reflective community of faith. It's not important that everyone knows Syriac, but it's important that someone knows Syriac. It's important that someone knows Coptic. The Pope is in with a Coptic bishop Pope today, or yesterday. These are all facets. We're all in there together. So it is the working, thinking life of the church. And I think theologia, I've been attracted to a definition that the Eastern Orthodox give of a theologian. And they say a theologian is someone who prays. And I think that's very nice, because anyone who prays is then a theologian. And tying this round back to what we just spoke about, in a sense, every, I think, thinking Christian, praying Christian is someone who comes up against the mystery, as Maria Clara said. The wonderful citation of Rana there, either a mystic or an atheist, that everyone, you must realize the shortfall of our concepts, the shortfall of our understanding before the godness of God, the great gift of our faith. So I think then a theologian is someone, theology should be overall, but particularly the kind of theology that Maria Clara and myself do, something that is helping people towards this mystery. And of course, as you know, this is often, as we see very wonderfully done in Aquinas, as much a matter of dismantling misconceptions about God as it is of positive assertions. So sometimes it seems to me that in Catholic circles, we consider theologians are people that are only those who are, as it were, in the employ of the Vatican, for instance, or something, and they're charged with hammering out what is the exact policy on such and such contentious issue, intercommunion, something like that. That is important. That's a specific kind of vocation. the ecumenical vocation, the moral vocation. But that is not what the theology must be. Theology, to be living, must be also not just analytic, but constructive theology. It must be imaginative. It must be listening to what is bothering people and coming up with constructive, positive, forward-looking articulations of the way our Catholic faith goes into the future, facing the problems. Yes, embracing what we have from the saints, from the community of saints from the past, but seeing how its needs seeing how the needs of the present community of the faithful can be met through this wonderful treasure trove.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Janet. Yeah, you give different perspectives with respect to how theology is experienced also by the community of people and how it has to be necessarily connected to the life of the church. So thank you. Maria Clara, what would you say about what's theology for? Especially from our context, maybe.
Yeah. Well, theology is defined as being the intelligence of faith. But the word intelligence, we always understand as only rational, and it's not. Intelligere is to penetrate in the interior of things, of the world. So I think theology is a gracious, a gratuitous thing. It's not useful, efficient in the way modernity understands that, but it is to think about this mystery where we are within, and mostly now with all the problem of the earth and the climate change, I think theology is more than ever connected with the earth, with the world, with the bodies, with the life in all its expressions. I think theology is to think about the mystery that inhabits in everything. The original theologian is the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is the one who makes theology within each of us. So some of us chose the way to be academical theologians, but everybody, everyone who is inspired by the Spirit is a theologian. Everyone who has the inhabitation of the Spirit is a theologian. So the Spirit can make this original theology, and this theology can have the form of poetry, of art, of music, of praise, of beauty, or of denouncing injustice, of prophecy, or so many things. In our continent, Rocío was asking me for go to the context in Latin America. In our continent, the last 50 or more than 50 years, there is a trend, a school of theology who is very attentive to the poor, to the injustice, to the conflicts in society, and how this injustice, this inequality, this oppression emerges as a call for faith, and how we can think of this context of oppression enlightened by the Word of God, and produce and having insights of transformative praxis and practices. Liberation theology was the school of theology. Sometimes people ask me, is liberation theology dead? No, it's not dead. It is very alive. It had a crisis, but it enlarged its scope, and now liberation theology is in Latin America thinking about the anthropological poverties, which are always there, the problem of gender, violence, gender, the problem of ecology, the problem of racism, the problem of the original people, ethnicities, all these problems, which are the problems of life. So I think theology is for that, is the thought about life and the mystery of God acting in this life.
I think if I can come in, that's a wonderful statement. And I think what Maria Clara's articulated is the need for theology to be constructive theology. You know, there was times in the past, say in the 19th century, where there could be theological handbooks and all priests would come to Rome and they'd get this or they'd get this emanating from Rome. And it would be good Plato to NATO. You know, this is, you come away with this handbook theology and that was do you for the rest of your life. Well, this is not a living thing. And it's not going to suit any pastor, any priest in ministry is going to come immediately upon problems that his professors, his rector didn't know about. How could people 40 years ago have thought about the issues we're facing with even the environmental crisis or gender theory or whatever? They couldn't. So what we need to not, as teachers of theology, is not teach people theology. We need to teach people how to be theologians. And that includes ordinary people, not just people who are going to be priests. And they have to do constructive theology and they have to see what are the needs of the people now. And of course, Latin American theology, liberation theology was prime moment, not just for South America, for the world, of teaching what it means to have to understand that this theology must come from our own, yes, embracing all that we've received, but come from within our own people in response constructively to what the needs of the people are before us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it's very true. It made me think like how we need to be as theologians and as people of, part of the church, how to be attentive to the signs of the times all the time, to be sensitive to that, to be able to read and to be attentive to the signs of the time, what is going on in the world that we need to answer, we need to reflect upon. No, very interesting. I want to encourage also the audience to ask questions. Feel free to add your questions in Spanish. If you want, in Portuguese, we have our wonderful Katia that will help us with that. So don't worry about the language. We are inspired by the Holy Spirit, so we can manage with that. So you can send me even the questions in private or public through the chat, and we will pass them to Janet and Maria Clara. So feel free to do that during our conversation. Our next question, I want to be a question addressed for both of you, but Maria Clara, it's your turn to start. Okay. So going back to the idea of mysticism, do you see any difference among the mystical experiences of women and of men? I mean, is there any difference that comes from the gender who is experiencing these mystical experiences also?
Yes, I do. In spite of many of very famous and fantastic theoreticians of mysticism say no, because the spirit doesn't have a gender, and that's right. But I think the spirit must not have a gender, but the mystical person, yes, has a gender. And I think women experience God in a different way than men. That can be some points of contact. For instance, I think St. John of the Cross has a lot of writings that could be written by a woman, for instance, the sensitivity. But normally, I think women invest and integrate much more the body, the senses, the body, mostly the body, into the experience. And I have been studying with some women mystics an experience of motherhood, which is which happens to them during their spiritual experiences. It's very interesting. Sometimes women that are not biological mothers, like Simone Weil, like Etty Hillesum, like Santa Teresa of Lisieux, but they experience those desires of create life and give their bodies, give light to other lives, and mostly to feed other lives with their own body. It's a kind of pregnancy, Eucharistical experience that is very evocative and very, I think, very luminous, and can say a lot about that. Also, I think women have a body that is analogical, has an analogy with the earth. The earth, its mother, produces fruits. When the earth is well treated, it is fruitful. When she is mistreated, is the disaster that we are facing. And I think the same is happening with women. And I think many women acceded to a certain knowledge of themselves, of an awareness of their body, and a knowledge of the mystery of God through this experience of having a body capable of generating otherness and feeding otherness concretely. So I think this is it's not the whole thing, but it's an element that is we can observe mostly in women mystics, up to my research and knowledge.
Maria Clara, you mentioned about motherhood just today, when it's at least in Chile, is the official Mother's Day, and the commercial one is this Sunday. But today is, I don't know if it's international.
No, but, ours is next Sunday. Next Sunday is
next Sunday, yeah. But it's today. It's exactly the day when they start like greeting us and so. Yeah, we didn't realize that when we organized the seminary, but it comes just in a good moment. Thank you, Janet. What do you think about the mystical experience of women and men? What have you seen during your studies? You are writing a book.
Well, I mean,
soon will be
the one
on Moses.
Rather dry comment is looking at the medieval mystics, there's quite a difference. But then the scholars, and I am not a medievalist, but the scholars say, well, of course, the women, many of them didn't know Latin. They're writing in their vernacular language. They didn't have access to the formation that the men had, and so they had many lay women, Marjorie Kemp, for instance, in this country, and to Julian of Norwich. They were clearly very theologically knowledgeable, but they didn't have Latin. They didn't have formulation. So that's one thing. It is because they're women, but it's what could they have done if they had known the Latin? But even with some that do have good Latin, like Gertrude of Helfta, I think there is a difference. And it comes with the physicality and the immersion, even for, I'm speaking at the moment of historical mystics. I'll come to a more modern situation. Even of those who are cloistered, like Gertrude of Helfta, who entered the cloister at 6 or something like that, there's a physicality to her writing and her sense of God. She speaks of God's, she's quite an interesting figure, because she says, well, she was a pretty indifferent nun. She didn't care much about it. She was much more interested in studying rhetoric and text, literary text, than she was in studying theology, until she had a kind of an awakening when she was a young woman of God's overwhelming grace. And she describes it as a gushing torrent pouring down upon her. And it's really, I don't want to sexualize this language, but the language is very sexualizable. You could say that this overwhelming gushing fluids, and she experiences God as coming to her like a young man, very handsome, 15 years old, and so on. So it's a different kind of experience than, for instance, if you look at Gregory of Nyssa, his talk about love and desire. It's all, it has to be channeled and it has to be directed and control the flow, and you can Freudianize that too. So I think there probably is quite a lot historically, we could say. But, you know, about the contemporary situation, I want to pick up on something Maria Clara said. And this is, maybe I have to speak more from my own experience, because I haven't done the research that she has done on many modern women mystics. But to me, the experience of pregnancy and childbirth was revolutionizing. Just having your body taken over in service of someone else's body, and you did not know who, knowing that this giving birth. I remember listening to, in a seminar, to someone, a philosopher, a man saying, well, there's some universals we can always say, which is our skin is the outside of our body. And I immediately thought to myself, not when you're pregnant, because the inside of your body is the outside of someone else's body. What an amazing thing that is. But it hasn't been theorized, because women haven't been writing theology and thinking about it. But the kind of unselving that goes on when you have small children, and I think it's with fathers as well as mothers, or anyone who attends to small children, their demands are relentless. They're unceasing. You're exhausted. There's no point you have to stand back. Oh, I'm going to I'll go and meditate for a while and look after being unselved. Yourself is stripped away. And I think for many people, that moment, you can find this in the monastic and religious life, but for many people, and for me, that was very dramatic. And then this union you have with this child who for so many months naturally thinks that your body is her body, because your body was her body, is your body. It dissolves all kinds of things. So I have written a bit about this, and I've found that men seem to like this kind of, can understand this too. So I don't want to restrict this kind of experience to biological mothers, but I think there's a lot we can learn from this whole repertoire of human experience that has been far too little examined by mainstream theology in the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating conversation. Janet, is it so that maybe you mentioned already some well-known names of mystics, Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich. What explains the popularity today of female mystics? Mm-hmm. What do you think? Well,
yes, of course, my context is a little bit different. I've had most of my teaching career in England, where I'm not in I'm in a university faculty, so my students could be, they're not necessarily Christians, they could be Jews, Muslims, whatever. I'm teaching Christian theology because we can teach that in English universities, not just in divinity schools. So I'm teaching a wide range of people, and I've found that they're very interested in these figures. And now I'm teaching at Duke, as you mentioned. There, my students are all theology students. They're all Christians. They're almost all Protestants, not all, but it's a Methodist divinity school. Mm-hmm. And one of the fascinating things that I've seen in my, say, 35, 40 years is studying theology and teaching theology is the embrace by Protestants or non-Catholics of the broad Catholic tradition, of the theologians of the early church, of the mystics and so on. They've really, and of course of Orthodox theologians, historical theologians as well, like Maximus the Confessor. What is there? I think it's an understanding, and this gets to our topic of aesthetics, that there are different ways of doing theology otherwise than analytic propositional categories that argue, if the atonement is thus, such and one, and it must be this, that, and the other, that kind of analytic way, which may have its purposes and roots, to this more contemplative way, to a slower theology, which is self-embracing. You know, I think a lot of these texts are deliberately written, I'm thinking particularly of Julian of Norwich, to be self-involving by the reader. Augustine's Confessions is another great example of a self-involving text. The reader is drawn into the text. We're listening to Augustine talking to God. It's an intimate space, but it's not an intrusive space. And I think this affords a kind of space for theological reflection that people can come without being hammered and lectured to, but being inducted, as it were, or led by hand. There's a lovely phrase, manuduction, led by hand, into a deepening of Christian life, and understanding that it's a journey, not a bunch of answers to questions. It's a journey. So I think there are a number of reasons why people are attracted. And also perhaps because when you're dealing with some of these historical figures, you're not, you know, they're at a distance, they're in a different kind of society. You can't say, oh, that was right, that was wrong, because it's different. And so that enables you to try to think, and this is a subject which is important to Maria Clara's mentioned, how do we understand some place quite different? Some, you know, what is it like to be a nun in a 13th century abbey in Germany? You know, that we know it's a different context, and perhaps that's like displacing, and knowing that we don't know opens us up to think, to be a bit more open with our own thought. But perhaps it is too, I want to come back to this thing because it was part of our title, the aesthetics of perhaps theology, not just in recent years, but perhaps since the disputes of the Reformation, has been overgiven to arguments and counter-arguments and answering the questions of opponents, and not enough, a lot of it, to sitting back and listening and responding from the center of your heart. That's a very great generalization, but I think part of what attracts people to these mystical texts is this bit of peace in them. Even, you know, you might say someone like Catherine of Siena, she was in all these people, or Julian, she was writing in the midst of terrible plagues and disasters. These people were not writing, and poverty, these weren't people writing at peaceful times. Catherine of Siena saw the whole church falling down around her, as far as she understood, but yet somehow this finding core of grace and gift to move forward and to find, you know, they found within themselves that they had been given a word that they had to speak out, not because they had to write for a CD or for a publisher or for everything like that, but for the good of the faithful community, and they gave that gift to us.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm really amazed by the conversation and how it brought our understandings of mysticism. Maria Clara, there is something that it's very, or can sound a little bit contradictory. How women of the 20th century who are mystics, but they don't fit necessarily into the Catholic rules, are very well read by Pope and bishops. You have studied Simone Weil, but maybe I'm thinking about Dorothy Day too. Like, how is that possible? It goes a little bit in the line of the question that we already made to Janet, but how is possible that women that do not necessarily fit into the Catholic Church rules or way of life, or they are not, and they are not even like part of the church, but they are inspiration for popes and bishops? How would you explain that?
Well, that's what fascinates me in the contemporary mystics. They are in the middle of secularity, modern secularity, awful situations, wars and things like that. The Great Depression, like Dorothy Day, in the war as Simone Weil and anti-Hillism. And in that situation, they managed to experience something very a great gift, like Janet said, the mystery of grace, the mystery of desire, and even beauty. I have to let the mystics speak instead of myself speaking. I have brought some sentences of Simone Weil and Dorothy Day to see how they experience beauty in a sort of inverted way. For instance, Simone Weil was in Assisi. She was crazy about St. Francis. She was agnostic, from Jewish origin, but agnostic. But she went to Assisi, and in the chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, it's a beautiful Romantic chapel, she writes, after the experience, no? There, alone, in the little 12th century Romanesque chapel of Santa Maria degli Angeli, an incomparable marvel of purity where St. Francis often used to pray, something stronger than I compelled me for the first time in my life to go down on my knees. Simone Weil came from the 1 year in the factory. She was broken inside and outside. She felt like a slave. She had really a very hard experience in that factory. But the beauty there compelled her to go on her knees. She doesn't know why. Her body was independent and her body went on her knees. After that, in the Benedictine Abbey of Salem, France, during the Holy Week, also she had unbearable migraines, very, very painful, and also the beauty of the Gregorian chant. And then she felt the presence of Christ's passion connecting those two aspects, beauty and pain. And she writes, this experience enabled me by analogy to get a better understanding of the possibility of loving divine love in the middle of affliction. It goes without saying that in the course of these services, the thought of the Passion of Christ entered into my being once and for all. And finally, a little bit larger text, but I think it's worth hearing, that she wrote, Hitler could die and return to life again 50 times, but I should still not look upon him as the Son of God. And if the gospel omitted all mention of Christ's resurrection, faith would be easier for me. The cross by itself suffices me. The proof, the really miraculous thing, is the perfect beauty of the accounts of the Passion, together with certain glowing words of Isaiah. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. And of St. Paul's, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. That is what compels me to believe. So Simone Weil experienced the cross as perfect beauty. This is a paradox, but mystics are very friendly with paradox, you know? So, and together with this love for the cross is the love for the poor that she has. The anxious desire to share, to be in communion with the pain of the others, with the pain of those who are in danger, with the pain of the poor. Well, Dorothy Day is a very different personality, but she has a description of the walks she did in the streets of Chicago that I think is very suggesting. The contemplative features of her personality appear there. When she walked by the poorest and most desolate suburbs of the city, her gaze was capable of finding unsuspected beauties where usually one could only see desolation and deprivation. For instance, one of her biographers observed, she had a gift for finding beauty in the midst of urban desolation. Drab streets were transformed by pungent odors, geranium and tomato plants, garlic, olive oil, roasting coffee, bread and rolls in bakery ovens. Here, she said, and I quote Dorothy Day, was enough beauty to satisfy me. The beauty of the life of the poor, the smells of the real life, the coffee, the oil, the geraniums, the tomato, and the desolation and the ugly streets of the suburbs. Later, during the years she lived with Foster Badham, who was a botanical, then he introduced her to the beauty of creation. And she was very urban in her tendencies and tastes, but she learned, guided by her companion, to discover beauty existing far away from those gray peripheries. She said that he taught her to be capable of reading the world of creation, this book of creation, discovered, and through it to find God's presence as origin and possibility of all existence. Dorothy Day didn't remain married with Foster Badham because she made herself Catholic and baptized her child too. And so it was before the council. She had absolutely to be married in the church, and Foster Badham never thought about it. So he went away. She loved him till the end of her life and was never together with him again. And then all this capacity of experiencing beauty where there is not evident beauty, she turned on to her love to the poor. She would live with the poor, within them, in the middle of them, till the end of her long life, 80 years old. So, that's what fascinates me in those mystics of the 20th century, to be capable of experiencing grace and beauty and the mystery of God in the middle of completely inverted and contrary situations, secular situations, hard situations. That's what seems to me fascinating. So, and I think that's why they inspire popes and bishops. For instance, Pope Benedict, when he resigned to papacy, in the sermon of the Ashes Wednesday, he quoted two women, Dorothy Day and Etty Hillesum. He quoted those two, speaking about conversion. Yeah.
Very fascinating. We are reaching our limit of time, but I have maybe two questions. There were two, but I will divide them into one for Janet and one for Maria Clara. Okay? So then we can enjoy them from both of you. So Janet, can a person have a Christian mystical experience even not belonging and not wanting to belong to an institution?
Well, I'm not even sure what it is to belong to an institution. I don't belong to an institution. I am a member of a number of things, but Simone Weil is such an interesting example. Maria Clara sketched it so well. And I think let's face it, both Simone Weil and Dorothy Day were in some ways really annoying, nutty people. They were far from perfect. This is what's really nice about them compared to all those pastel female saints we've had in the past who didn't do anything wrong and made all the right judgments. These women did not. They did crazy things. I mean, Simone Weil really killed herself. And I am a great admirer. She had immense power. And what I want to pick up on is what was implanted in her early on is a desire to know the poor. And I wonder if that isn't what brings people into this kind of experience we're describing, whether they're Christian or Muslim or anything or nothing. That's one way anyway. Maybe the experience of beauty, of nature is another. But they and a lot of women understood the poor and the afflicted. Now, I think Simone Weil is one of the great contributions she has done for the world, is to talk about the afflicted, these are the people who are so downcrowded, they have no self-identity. She says a wonderful passage. She said the martyrs who walked into the Colosseum to be sacrificed to lions, they were not afflicted. They went confidently, they went joyously. To be afflicted is to be despised, to have no self-identity. And the people that she saw, because she went deliberately, she was from a pretty wealthy background, highly educated at the Sorbonne. She deliberately worked at a Renault factory anonymously. Her constitution wasn't suited to this. And she just saw that these women, mostly women working there, they were afflicted. They couldn't protest about their wages or their hours or anything because they were supporting their family and they were so worried of losing their jobs. And she just understood what this kind of to be trapped and stripped of everything. And she saw Christ on the cross in this way as afflicted. And it's interesting that this kind of moment becomes a moment that she sees beauty as well in pain. One of the things I think modern Christians, in my experience, find odd about the mystics is so often they prayed for pain. They prayed to suffer. And I don't advocate this for anyone, but one way that I think we can understand this, if we think of Catherine of Siena, why she suffered, a lot of her suffering was because she suffered because she understood the church was falling apart through mismanagement. So it was like Mary's suffering at the foot of the cross. It was not that Mary herself was physically wounded, but she sees her son tortured on the cross. That kind of pain, that kind of maternal pain is very real. And I think that for a number of these women, and including people like Simone Weil, who had a profound belief in God and love in a sense for Catholic teaching, but in a sense, she said she didn't need to enter the church because Christ had already come to her and adopted her as his own, which I think is a good Jewish thing to say. I think certainly she's one of the chosen people. She just knew it. She didn't need to sort of have any water poured over her. And I think that obviously we do see in this that God reaches out and brings people into his love. She would be, to my mind, one of the great teachers of Christians. I wouldn't call Simone Weil a great Christian teacher because she wouldn't want to be described that way, but I can call her a great teacher of Christians. Amen, amen. I think she is. And so we can't be, we have to look around and see where God's grace is flowing. And if it's flowing on strange Jewish intellectuals who are in Marseille fleeing for their life from Hitler, then that's where it's flowed. Yes, it can. God's grace can touch everyone, and many people through them.
Thank you, Janet. Not sure whether you already mentioned it, but I wanted to ask Maria Clara if really from your study about Simone Weil, and we already talked about this, but does it matter that Simone Weil never wished to be received into the church? What do you think?
Oh, for me, it doesn't matter at all. In fact, the last information is that she was kind of baptized when she was very sick, almost dying. She was visited by a Jewish friend, female friend, and she asked this friend, take a little water from the tap, pour into my head and say these words, the words in Latin, the words of the baptism. And the friend did it. And she kept secret in respect for the family after her death. But finally, Georges Jourdain, a good thinker, very admired very much Simone Weil, she talked to Georges Jourdain years after the death of Simone Weil, and he said, you can't keep the secret. You have to talk because you'll die with this secret. And then she recorded a video. Simone Dietz is her name. And she tells, is this baptism valid? I think it's more valid than many baptisms that are made in our parishes, because really there was a desire of her. She loved everything in Christianity, but she disagreed profoundly with some things of the church. So I think to be Christian is not exactly belonging to a church. You can belong, make the rituals and be that, but not being living the deep and profound truth of the gospel. And I think Simone Weil did live. Like her, others too. Etty Hillesum was born and died Jewish. She read the New Testament, St. Augustine, etc., and the Russians, and Hölderlin, and but the life of this woman and the experience she made are. You can't hate anybody. You have to forgive. If there was one single German decent, you can't hate the whole people. So, and at the end, when she was already in the train to Auschwitz, she dropped a postcard by the window, and it was written, "I wanted to be a lily of the valley," because of the passage of the gospel. Solomon, with all his glory, was not so beautiful as a lily of the valley. So I think these are saints. I don't fear of calling them saints without crown, without chapel, but they have this fundamental holiness that is to live, like Janet's taught a very important thing, compassion. Simone Weil said, to those who love, really, compassion is a torment, It's not something sweet. It's not something that you do once a week, you have your poor. No, it's a torment. You can't, you are aching to share the pain of the other. You gave the example of Mary close to the cross. We have many of those examples. Well, and Simone Weil in London was desperate because she wanted to enter France and be in danger together with her people, and de Gaulle didn't allow it. And she was really suffering, but very, very painfully. So this compassion, this communion with the pain of the other, I think it's a characteristic of, for instance, Simone Weil, for instance, of Etty Hillesum, for instance, of many human beings that didn't belong to a church, didn't enter a church, but they lived the spirit of the gospel of Jesus.
Thank you, Maria Clara. Thank you, Janet. We have come to the end of this insightful conversation on mysticism, women, and theological aesthetics. I would like to express my gratitude to our two guest speakers, Janet how do you say it, Soskice?
Soskice, that's right.
Yeah, and Maria Clara Bingemer, for sharing their knowledge and insight with us today. Your expertise, oh no, my dogs.
Your microphone.
No, my dogs.
Yeah, it's Mother Day. It's Mother Day in Chile.
And so your expertise and passion for this topic, which really has been very inspiring. Thank you for all of you that joined us today to learn, discuss, and receive new perspectives on the intersection of mysticism, women, and theological aesthetics. Oh no, the beings here in my house are like interrupting my closing. Remember that the conversation doesn't have to end here. Please feel free to follow up our speakers and organizers and Ecclesia in America, because we will continue with these sets of webinars about women and the role of women in the church and the society, probably next semester. So we will continue with this series of about 6 seminars related to the role of women in our church, society, and today. So we will keep you posted. And thank you so much for this meeting. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Maria Clara. And all of you have a wonderful evening and night as well.
And thank you, Rocío, our
Yes, thank you,
wonderful
Rocío.
moderator. And thank you, Peter Casarella, our wonderful translator, which is behind the curtain.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, one of the founders of Ecclesia in America as well.
Yes.
So thank you.
Thank you very
Have
much.
a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Janet. It was an honor to meet you.
Bye-bye. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. Bye-bye.
Mhm.